Abdoulaye is going to share with us, as part of what will be a cumulative conversation, who are we, or at least who are some of us, and why does that matter? Dele described this as philosophy to end the day, but I would say that it's maybe applied philosophy, because Abdoulaye has another more mischievous purpose to his work. So Abdoulaye, I'll turn it over to you.
W.E.B. Du Bois, the very first African-American to get a PhD in sociology, in 1897 penned a paper titled The Conservation of Race. In this paper, Du Bois contended with the attitude and the wishes of most African-American of that period and also many white allies. Those African-Americans who were intellectual and activists wanted to move beyond blackness. That is, to be diluted in a society which is predominantly white and to forget about their own identity. And Du Bois' position was the following: we shall not do until we have contributed our share to the rest of the world. That is, we, black people. So let us not accept simple mimicry, simple imitation. Let us build first and foremost our own ideal, and once we are recognized as part and parcel of humanity, we can now reach out to our white brothers and build a race-free society. Today, there is a new trend in France. This trend is the claim of a black identity. This is extremely different from what happened during the interwar period. During that period, the interwar period, people of African descent in France were aspiring for undifferentiation. That is, to not be differentiated from the rest of the French society. They wanted to be just anonymous in the French society, the same way as the white people in France were anonymous. The Senegalese soldier Bakary Diallo, who left Senegal, enrolled in the French army during the First World War, and who fought with the French troops against the Germans, was born in a country where France was already present, and what he experienced in Senegal was racism, discrimination in the hands of the French white administrators. But when he arrived in France, he saw a different story, or he heard a different story, and he experienced something different. And for him, the France he saw in France was the true embodiment of freedom, equality, and fraternity. So now we fast forward, and in this 21st century, we see the emergence of scores of organizations built by people of African descent. And the purpose, the cause that is defended by this organization of African descent is the making of a black identity in contemporary France. They don't want to be just the French, or rather, what they are mostly called, French of African descent or French of immigrant descent. They refuse to be that. They are asking the French state to call them black. How can we understand the approach of such people and their willingness and their claim to be called black? The very first thing is that the aspiration for universalism and undifferentiation has not been met. France, despite its Republican ideology, is in reality a country where racial identity shapes the future of an individual with regard to housing, with regard to employment, with regard to many other things you can mention. And for people of African descent who start now claiming a black identity, the only way to bring the French state to recognize the issue of racial discrimination is to start counting people on the basis of race. Those of you who know France know that in the French society, there is no census about race. And as a result, it becomes extremely difficult to measure the effect of race on people's daily life. So this is the reason why organizations built by people of African descent are working toward the recognition of race. In 2009, for the very first time in the history of France, there is an institution which is an extremely influential institution called the CSA, Conseil supérieur de l'audiovisuel. Since 2009, the CSA publishes every year what it calls the Barometer of Diversity. And what the Barometer of Diversity is about is to ask every single French channel to break down, racially speaking, the identity of the people who participate in the TV programs. How many people of visibly black, that is the term, by the way, they use, visibly black, visibly Arab, visibly Asian, visibly white. So how many people are participating in this program? So this is just, among many, one success that I want to mention. But at the same time, we know that racial identity is an unfinished project. Today, we're saying black, and quite interestingly, we include within this group those who used to be labeled or called mixed race people. But who knows what blackness would be in 50 years from now, 100 years from now.
Abdoulaye, as a visibly black man, I find your provocation really interesting. I've got lots of questions. I'm sure other people have lots of questions too. How do you see this affecting not just France, but Francophone Africa? A shift in identity, or maybe it's a duality. What does that look like if someone is, in a French context, describing themselves as black, but yet they're part of a larger Francophone population within Africa?
In Francophone Africa, and since decolonization, race was not a thing. I used to tell my students, well, you know, back there in Senegal, we don't have race, we're all black over there. And they smile. But now the situation is changing. Why? For one reason. Because we have a huge population of Africans who used to be part of what we call the diaspora. Mm-hmm. So they left Africa, went to Canada or the US or France, et cetera, et cetera. Some of them were actually born in the West. And they made the choice to return to Senegal or to Mali or to Cote d'Ivoire. And we now see the use of the words black and white. And quite interestingly, to see the label white apply to people who are darker than me. My grandma sometimes called me, hey, my white grandson. And I smile and I say, okay, I'm as dark as your grandma. But the thing is, actually, what they are just trying to convey is the fact that race is not only a matter of color. Yeah. It is also a matter of culture. When you move to places such as Mali, Senegal, etc., and you hear people who have barely, interacted with other than black people who claim the identity of black. This identity of black is, of course, an imitation of the American model. And black also for them is equivalent to high culture. So when they claim the identity of black in a place like Senegal or like Mali or Burkina Faso instead of the identity of African, they are also claiming ownership of this civilization.
Yeah. You put your finger on where I see a real tension, which is in African-American culture, there is suspicion, there is resentment, there is ostracization of Africans, of Caribbeans, of people who are not, black, mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. It's like, even when Barack Obama ran for president, there's a question about the fact, well, his father is Kenyan, but is he black?
Is he black? Yeah.
And it was probably only because he's married to Michelle that he was able to get the real street cred. And now we have the same issue with Kamala Harris, whose father is from Jamaica. So, you know, not black, just she's kind of black. How do you navigate this potential tension between a black America that wants to see itself in the eyes of Du Bois as separate and superior to build greater solidarity? How do you bridge that perception between black Americans and Africans across the diaspora so that they can find common cause?
It reminds me of a few lines in Rachel Wright's book, Black Power. Rachel Wright visited Africa, many African countries, and one of those countries is Ghana. And Rachel Wright tells in the book a story that he experienced. He went into a shop, and the person behind the desk asked him, "Have you found your roots?" And Rachel Wright's answer was, "You fellow who sold me and the white man who bought me did not leave any record." So slavery has created this, this distance, this issue between people of African descent around the world. And what Wright was trying to say is that actually, until you also reckon that you have been part and parcel of our, of the transatlantic trade, we African American will never be truly Africans. We have the same debate. In France, as you know, France has been also a part of the slave trade, transatlantic slave trade. And France, just like the United States, has a community of descendants of the slave trade. And when the movement that I'm starting actually start building, there was a whole conversation about who can claim the right to call themselves black. People from the Caribbean were saying that we have been the product of the slave trade. So as a result, we have some entitlement to the concept of blackness. But on the other hand, those who were from the African context were saying, actually, what you forget is that you left sons or fathers or mothers behind. And those ones who were suffering as much as you who've left. So we too have the right to claim this label, to say we are black and to make reference to the slave trade as victims of the slave trade. It allows both those who have been transplanted, as they use, the term is the one they use in France, and those who stay behind to claim it.
Yeah. What more would you want to see in France as a result of the fuller expression of a black identity as opposed to an African one?
What I think that is extremely important, and this is going to be a defining moment in this fight for recognition of a black identity, is really the introduction of race in the census. If you wanted to fight discrimination, you have to know exactly who is discriminated. Just let's take the metaphor of illness and medication. If you don't identify the disease and name it properly, you won't be able to find the cure, right? So in terms of racial discrimination, we have the same process to go through. We have to know exactly how many people of African descent graduated from university. And now, once they have graduated, how many of them have landed a job in this specific sector of specialization? That way, we can know exactly if there is discrimination or not. But as long as we are in this foggy, environment, not naming things, it would become very difficult to move forward.
So this also assumes that the remedy would be racial.
Yeah.
And that strikes at the heart of this notion of liberty, equality, and fraternity.
Exactly.
So what is the counter-narrative to the French story of liberty, equality, and fraternity to make the case for focusing on race?
In order to answer this question, I just want to draw a parallel between France and the United States. Both of them had to undergo a revolution in order to exist. And when you read the US Constitution, The Constitution First Amendment say that, okay, it is self-evident that all men were born equal. You take the French Constitution, it says France is a democratic, secular republic. It guarantees equality to all its citizens, regardless of race, regardless of origin, regardless of religion. So you have both countries that are extremely attached to the issue of equality. But what we know also is that America is more attached to liberty than it is to equality. And France is more attached to equality than it is to liberty. France is now aware of the fact that if race continues to become a real issue in this society, the whole structure of this society will collapse. And the whole structure of society is equality. What they do is to say, let us put more resources into this neighborhood, knowing exactly that in this neighborhood you have a high concentration of black people, of Arab people, of other racial minorities.
You also said that that category of who is black incorporates mixed race people, people who are multiracial. What might you expect that category to look like in another 50 years as people continue to intermarry, as multiracial populations continue to increase? Are the black populations going to increase in France, or will there be something else?
During the colonial period, France was not a colorblind society.
Right.
France was really race conscious. This is just an example I'm going to give. In Senegal, in Indochina, in Mali, etc., the French state had made the decision to separate mixed-race children from their mother and father, put them in different schools, raise them as white French, and to exclude them from the rest of the society. Because the mixed-race children were seen as a threat to the social order. For the French Constitution, having these mixed-race children would simply jeopardize the project of having a society where white supremacy is a reality. Again, as I mentioned earlier, there's no census on race, but there are ways in which we can know how many people approximately in France are black or Arab or et cetera, et cetera. And demographers, I have some friends who are demographers who are doing research of this type.
It's the grandparent question.
Exactly, ancestry.
Yeah.
They will ask you, okay, from which country your father or your mother coming from which country your grandfather, your grandmother, et cetera. So this issue of mixed race, today, quite interestingly, what happened is that it is the population of African descent who has taken the decision to define themselves instead of letting the French state define them. They are the ones who say mixed race are blacks. Okay. And this is in line with what is happening in the United States, as you know. Because what we have also to know is that the black movement is very much connected to what is happening in the United States.
Is what you propose and what you're describing, is it a way also to speak directly to, I mean, you mentioned white supremacy, but so the flip side of that coin is anti-blackness.
Yeah.
Is this a way to more directly address anti-blackness within France, and how so?
As you know, the right wing is thriving in France, but also in many Western European countries. In France, Macron is having trouble today to form a government because the right wing is extremely powerful and can bring down any government that Macron would be appointing. Yeah. So this is a defining moment in the history of France. We cannot understand, indeed, the evolution to this claiming a black identity without taking into consideration the pervasiveness of racism and anti-blackness in the French society, and to count people on the basis of race. Because if you count people on the basis of race, you're not going to stop there. You see, okay, how many of these black people got a university degree?
Right.
You see how many of these black people have, live in this type of residence, et cetera, et cetera. And at some point, you will connect the dots. You will understand how come that, for instance, 28% of people who identify as black Africans have a university degree. Compared to the French national average, 21%. But at the same time, when you look at distribution of this population with regard to occupation, 9% only of people of African descent who had this university degree as holding what we call a white-collar job. And on the other hand, Italians, I take Italians because this is an ethnic minority, they have only 17% among them have a university degree, but 13% of them have a white-collar occupation. So if you don't know this, you would have some trouble to understand why certain type of people are confined into some position and other people are thriving in the society.
Thank you.
I have a brief comment to offer and then a question that I want to pose to John Daisy, who is sitting in the far corner there, an Irishman from Boston.
Yes.
The comment is that I was fascinated by your saying that there is this like struggle or competition about who will be allowed to identify themselves as black. It used to be that people want to pass.
Yes. Yeah.
So you've come a long way, baby.
Exactly.
That boggles the mind. What is the advantage to be claimed in fighting over who's going to be black? The question, though, and I said John Daisy specifically because we have this running joke. When did Irish people become white in America? Right? Because that gives us some kind of insight into these passages and transitions that the two of you have been speaking so eloquently about.
Go for it, John. When did the Irish become white? And how long have you been white, John?
As a recently visibly white guy, it's a complicated history. So very briefly, W.E.B. Du Bois made a famous statement about the condition of blacks in America in 1890, early 1920s, and indicated that at that point you still had some actual folks who were slaves and descendants of slaves, and indicated they were the poorest in all of America, except for the Irish immigrants, who were the poorest. And they were called Black Irish. It was considered Black 47, where Ireland lost a third of its entire population in 5 years with famine and emigration. And almost all came to the United States and mostly settled in the Northeast. And were despised by all the other immigrants who had already come in there, except the blacks at the time. And the Irish were able to scrape by on the generosity of the black people in the Northeast. And, you know, unfortunately, the tale goes that once their economic condition surpassed that, they no longer used that phrase and became white in the United States. It was very much tied to economics. But that ability to have gotten there was almost entirely dependent on the generosity of African Americans in the northern and northeast part of the United States.
When did you become white?
Still black.
Yes, yes. He doesn't want to indict himself, but that's okay. That's okay. When you feel comfortable being white, you just let us know.
So during the whole civil rights, actually, during that period of time, the Irish were considered as, you know, the equals of black. They were sharing the same neighborhood with black. They were sharing the same jobs with blacks, et cetera, et cetera. So they, as a result, they were associated with blackness. But then by the end of the Second World War, we saw the Irish condition changing significantly and very positively. If you wanted to change your social status, you have to change your residence. And because their money allowed them to leave the neighborhood they used to share with black people. So they, at some point, like many white Americans, went to the suburbs and started living there. So progressively, their condition changed. And of course, this would have, because this change was possible, America was able to elect an Irish man, Kennedy, as president in the 1960s.
There have been numerous instances of groups becoming white in the United States. The Italians, Jews, Eastern Europeans as well. But there's been a hard barrier for black people, and this is what I think gets to anti-blackness specifically as a barrier that people can't cross. Black people don't get to become white in the United States, but lots of other people will get to become white, or white presenting, to use the old South African terminology, honorary white, even if you're not actually white, except for black people.
That's extremely important and interesting to highlight. I remember a debate between James Baldwin and William Buckley in London. Because Buckley's argument was, okay, you blacks, if you just do what other people had done, you will be thriving economically and politically speaking. And Baldwin says, okay, well, actually, that is possible if we manage to change the color of our skin. Because of the color of our skin, you don't let us vote. You don't let us live in the neighborhood where we wanted to live, et cetera, et cetera. Yep. So this is a way to say that, of course, passing is possible for a certain number of groups, but it is not something that is available to the majority of black people in the United States. And that is the case still today.
It is interesting how, if you ask many Africans, they won't say they are black. And I'm happy you're having a conversation with an African American in Africa. They think they're, of course they're African. Even for me, I keep saying I became black in Cambridge, like in the heart of whiteness. And so how do we get back to global blackness or global Africa and center Africanness? Because I think even the question of black doesn't arise once we start thinking about global Africanity, or because these are the same Africans in diaspora who had to now identify as black because they were in dialectical relationship with whiteness in the US. And then how do we center that Africanness?
I think that when I say we, I say people of African descent. We must accept the diversity within us, the different ways in which we can articulate our identity, whether we use the term blackness, or we use the term Afro-American, or we use the term African-American, or even sometimes, as you say, in French right now, among the Caribbean people of Caribbean descent, the new word is descendant of slaves. That is their way of manifesting, expressing their blackness. Because what they wanted to convey through this term is the fact that there has been a period in the history of humanity where only one group of persons were enslaved, and it was on the basis of the race. So I don't think we will ever get to and I don't want that to happen, by the way, to a unified, single blackness. I think that it's healthier to have a diversity of modes of expression of blackness.
So avoiding essentialism.
Avoiding essentialism.